The moon had not risen over the Guadalcanal Strait that night, but the ocean was restless, a dark mirror fractured by the wake of unseen currents. A fine mist clung to the water's surface, and the rhythmic slap of waves against the hulls of small American craft was the only sound that punctuated the Pacific night. On the northern approaches to Tulagi, 3 PT boats of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, M to Bron 3, glided silently over the black waters. Their low profiles made them nearly invisible to a distant observer, and yet their engines, the twin Packard 4 M2 500s, could push them to speeds surpassing 40 knots, faster than any destroyer daring to run the reinforcement routes. Lieutenant John A.F. Jack Kelly, a 28-year-old veteran of the early Solomons operations, sat hunched over the helm of PT-123. His face was illuminated intermittently by the soft glow of the navigation panel, revealing the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Despite his youth, Kelly had developed a reputation for composure under fire, a trait indispensable in these nocturnal operations. He scanned the horizon, listening for the faint mechanical hum that would signal the approach of Japanese warships. Intelligence reports indicated that tonight a small destroyer group, part of the Tokyo Express, would attempt another supply and troop run to Guadalcanal. The Japanese believed the waters were safe after repeated night runs. They had never encountered the PT boats with any success that caused significant damage. The PT boats themselves were fragile, almost laughably so to the uninitiated eye. 37 feet long, constructed primarily of mahogany, with a beam scarcely wider than a man could stretch his arms, these boats were little more than high-speed torpedo platforms with a skeleton crew. Each carried 4 torpedoes mounted on the deck, backed by twin .50 caliber machine guns and a handful of 20mm cannons on some variants. To the US Navy brass, these boats were curiosities at best, a dangerous experiment that might damage nothing more than a few barges if luck were on their side. Yet their value lay not in brute force, but in stealth and speed, 2 attributes that conventional wisdom could not measure against the rigid confidence of a Japanese destroyer captain. Kelly's executive officer, Ensign Robert Bob Sullivan, crouched near the forward torpedo mounts, checking the clamps on their Mark 8 torpedoes. "All secured, sir," he whispered, mindful that any clatter could betray their presence. A veteran of several PT boat night operations, Sullivan knew that the smallest misstep could turn an audacious strike into a catastrophic failure. The torpedoes themselves were temperamental, their guidance primitive, and the crews had learned to compensate with precise calculations of angle, speed, and timing. In the darkness, the difference between a direct hit and a torpedo splashing harmlessly in the wake of an enemy vessel could be measured in mere feet, or worse, in lives. Intelligence had become a lifeline. The Navy's code-breaking efforts, combined with reconnaissance flights over the Solomon Islands, had revealed patterns in the Japanese movements. Destroyers favoured the western approach to Guadalcanal, hugging the shoreline at high speed to evade air patrols. Their complacency was as much a liability as their heavy armament. Radar was still primitive aboard most Japanese ships, searchlights were inconsistent, and crews rarely anticipated an attack from such small, fast vessels. To Kelly, this presented both an opportunity and a moral hazard. He knew that while his boats could strike like lightning, the margin for error was vanishingly small. As they approached the coordinates indicated in the intelligence brief, Kelly allowed himself a moment to observe the waters. The Solomons were notoriously treacherous, with reefs rising sharply from deep channels, jagged rocks hidden beneath the black waves, and sudden squalls that could appear without warning. The Japanese, confident in their destroyers' speed and firepower, often treated these waters with an arrogance that bordered on hubris. It was a dangerous oversight. Night in the Solomons was the PT boat's greatest ally, and Kelly intended to exploit every second of it. The night air carried a faint scent of salt and the distant smoke of burning coconut palms along the northern shoreline. The ocean reflected no moonlight, but small phosphorescent sparks traced the paths of their wakes. PT-122 and PT-124 maintained tight formation, their crews communicating in hushed tones and hand signals, each man aware that a single error could unravel the mission. For the Japanese destroyers, the waters were familiar territory, and yet, ironically, that familiarity bred negligence. They assumed that no small craft could maintain the speeds necessary to threaten a ship displacing over 2,000 tons, and they had not encountered a PT boat that could exploit night and speed simultaneously. Kelly's mind wandered briefly to the broader campaign. Guadalcanal had become a crucible, a test of endurance, ingenuity, and nerve. The Marines ashore struggled to hold Henderson Field, while the Japanese reinforced their positions under cover of darkness. US air power was stretched thin, unable to patrol continuously. In this gap, the PT boats had emerged as a vital tool, agile, daring, and willing to challenge the invincible myth of the Japanese destroyer. Kelly felt the familiar mix of anticipation and dread that always accompanied night operations. Each mission was a calculated gamble, each success a rare but decisive disruption to enemy supply lines. At precisely 2230 hours, the first faint lights of the Japanese destroyers appeared on the horizon, distant and almost serene against the black waters. The crews of the PT boats froze, knowing the next several minutes would define the night. In silence, Kelly issued the commands to approach, engines throttled to avoid detection while staying fast enough to strike before the destroyers could react. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every splash of water against the hull a drum signalling the onset of an invisible war. The Japanese had no inkling that these small American craft were closing in at 40 knots, armed with torpedoes capable of crippling their pride and firepower. In these moments, the PT boats embodied a paradox. Vulnerable yet lethal, inconspicuous yet unstoppable in their own domain. For Kelly and his men, the calm before the storm was a familiar tension, a prelude to action that demanded courage, skill, and a measure of luck that no intelligence report could guarantee. Across the waters, the destroyers continued their steady, confident advance, unaware that history was closing in on them, not in the form of overwhelming firepower, but in the shape of 3 small, mahogany-skinned boats, moving silently, dangerously fast, and carrying death on the tips of their torpedoes. As the PT boats pressed forward into the shadowed waters of the Solomons, the night held its breath. The war poised to remind both sides that even the smallest craft could reshape the destiny of men and ships alike. The first contact had not yet been made, but for the Americans aboard MTBR on 3, the coming hours would test everything they knew about speed, stealth, and the vulnerability of the seemingly invincible. Before a PT boat could become a harbinger of destruction, it had to be understood as a concept rather than merely a craft. In the briefing room at Tulagi, the small assembly of officers from Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 reviewed the latest intelligence reports. Lieutenant John A.F. Jack Kelly leaned over the chart table, tracing the projected route of a Japanese destroyer formation expected that night. The scribbled notes and intercepted radio transmissions represented months of painstaking observation, analysis, and careful deduction. Yet despite the data, the U.S. Navy High Command remained skeptical. PT boats were often dismissed as glorified speedboats, inadequate for confronting heavily armed destroyers capable of laying down hundreds of shells per minute. But for Kelly and his men, the PT boat was an instrument of surprise. With a top speed approaching 40 knots and a draft of just 2 feet, PT boats could slice through shallow channels, navigate reefs invisible to radar, and exploit darkness with near impunity. The boats were constructed of layered mahogany, chosen for its combination of lightness and resilience. The twin Packard engines, designed originally for racing powerboats, were modified to produce bursts of up to 1,350 horsepower each. This combination of speed and maneuverability gave crews the ability to close in on enemy targets faster than a destroyer could effectively target them, then retreat just as rapidly into the night. Kelly's attention shifted to the PT-123 itself. 4 Mark 8 torpedoes rested on deck, each 21 inches in diameter and 21 feet long, their tips polished and primed. Unlike the more advanced aerial torpedoes, the Mark 8s relied on precise calculations of speed, range, and angle of approach. Misjudge these, and the torpedo would pass harmlessly beneath the target, or strike at an angle that minimized damage. Kelly traced the trajectory diagrams he had drawn the previous day, calculating the point at which the PT boat would need to accelerate to intercept the destroyer's stern. "Remember," Kelly said, addressing his officers in the dim light of the cabin, "we're not relying on firepower alone. Speed and surprise are our weapons. The Japanese have never faced a PT boat moving at 40 knots in total darkness. They expect nothing smaller than a cruiser or destroyer to threaten them at night. That's our advantage." Ensign Robert Sullivan, his executive officer, nodded thoughtfully. "The charts indicate reefs near the Western Channel. We can't risk a collision. Engines at full throttle, but timing and positioning must be exact." The officers discussed their approach in meticulous detail. PT boats would operate in small groups of 2 or 3, maintaining silent formations until the last possible moment. Radar on these boats was either absent or rudimentary. Reliance was placed on visual sightings, auditory cues, and intelligence from previous reconnaissance. Spotting a destroyer's silhouette against the faint phosphorescence of the ocean required calm nerves and an intimate understanding of the local waters. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyer crews slept, or believed they did. Captains of the Fubuki class and Akatsuki class vessels held unwavering confidence in their speed, firepower, and radar-assisted navigation. Post-war interrogations revealed that the men of the 4th Air Group and their destroyer counterparts underestimated not only the American resolve, but the very capability of the PT boats themselves. Intelligence reports captured by the Allies indicated that Japanese officers considered PT boat attacks a nuisance, unlikely to alter operational plans. No destroyer commander believed that a tiny, mahogany-skinned craft could pose a serious threat at night. This overconfidence was central to the PT boat's advantage. Kelly often reflected on it during long patrols. For every destroyer assuming dominance in the Solomons night waters, there existed a PT boat crew calculating every possibility, every risk, and every opportunity for disruption. The American approach emphasized agility and initiative rather than overwhelming force. Torpedoes were the key, but not the only weapon. Strafing with .50 caliber guns could suppress deck crews long enough to ensure a successful torpedo launch. As the officers ran through the sequence of operations, the mechanics of a strike became clearer. Each boat would accelerate silently to the pre-designated firing point, close in under cover of darkness, and release torpedoes in coordinated salvos. The key was timing. Too early, and the torpedoes could be detected or miss entirely. Too late, and the boats would be overrun by enemy gunnery. The navigation calculations required constant adjustments for currents, tides, and speed of the destroyers, an exercise in applied mathematics at sea under extreme stress. Kelly also emphasized the psychological component. "We can't underestimate the value of surprise," he said. "Destroyer crews are trained to expect conventional threats. If we appear as nothing more than streaks in the water, they won't react quickly enough. Their perception of dominance works against them." The officers nodded, internalizing the notion that their most effective weapon was not just torpedoes, but stealth combined with audacity. Rehearsals on the water had become routine, with crews running full-speed approaches along predetermined markers at night, simulating torpedo launches. Post-action reports from prior engagements had shown that every second counted. The difference between escape and destruction was often measured in tens of seconds, and crews learned to trust instinct, training, and the coordination signals that allowed them to synchronize maneuvers even in complete darkness. In these exercises, the limitations of PT boats were evident. Engines were temperamental. Over-revving could result in mechanical failure. Torpedoes occasionally malfunctioned, running erratically or failing to detonate. And the margin for error in navigation was small, particularly in the Solomons, where hidden reefs and strong currents could easily destroy a boat before it even engaged the enemy. Yet these very vulnerabilities forced crews to develop a discipline, a cohesion, and an improvisational skill set unmatched in conventional naval warfare. As night fell over Tulagi and the surrounding waters, Kelly reviewed the final intelligence reports. Radar interceptions and code breaking had indicated a Japanese destroyer group moving south from Bougainville, intending to make a high-speed run to Guadalcanal. The coordinates, while imprecise, were sufficient to allow PT-123, PT-122, and PT-124 to position themselves for a surprise strike. The crew of PT-123 performed final engine checks, adjusted torpedo clamps, and confirmed firing angles. Each man understood the stakes. A single miscalculation could be fatal, but success could disrupt Japanese supply lines, saving countless American lives on Guadalcanal. As they prepared to depart, Kelly looked over the water, noting the interplay of shadows and currents. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese destroyers steamed confidently through waters they considered secure. They had not anticipated American PT boats capable of closing distances at 40 knots, guided by meticulous intelligence and audacious leadership. For the first time that night, Kelly allowed himself a tight, controlled smile. In these small, fragile boats, the Americans possessed a weapon the enemy had never considered: speed, stealth, and the audacity to strike when least expected. The sky above the Solomons was a matte black, dotted sparsely with stars that offered little guidance. The waters around Tulagi were restless, rippling with currents that shifted unpredictably among reefs and shallow channels. PT-123, PT-122, and PT-124 cut through the waves, their twin Packard engines throbbing quietly at half throttle. Lieutenant Kelly crouched low on the deck, peering through the darkness with binoculars, every nerve attuned to the faintest glint of metal. Navigation was a combination of art and science. Charts were incomplete, often compiled from previous patrols, reconnaissance flights, and intelligence reports intercepted from Japanese communications. The currents near Savo Island had claimed more than one boat. The Solomons were notorious for luring overconfident crews onto coral reefs. Yet Kelly trusted the crew implicitly. Each man had been trained to respond instantly to his commands, to anticipate his movements, and to execute maneuvers with practiced precision. At 21:37 hours, Ensign Sullivan whispered from the forward turret, "Radar indicates movement starboard, approximately 8,000 yards out, bearing 045. Kelly's heart quickened, but his expression remained composed. "Visual confirmation first," he ordered. The men strained their eyes into the inky horizon, the faint glow of the phosphorescent waters occasionally illuminating the wake of distant vessels. Then a ripple of reflection glinted across the waves, a silhouette sleek and angular. Japanese destroyers, fast and confident, steamed through the night with no hint of their imminent danger. The Japanese captains were operating under the assumption that the darkness and their speed granted them impunity. According to post-war interrogations, they had been briefed on American patrols, but discounted the possibility of an organized strike. Their mindset reflected overconfidence cultivated over months of Tokyo Express runs, in which they delivered troops and supplies under cover of night with minimal interference. To them, a PT boat at 40 knots was an annoyance at best, not a legitimate threat. Kelly signalled the other boats with a series of lights briefly flashed and quickly extinguished. PT-122 acknowledged, maintaining formation 50 yards off his port bow. PT-124 mirrored the movement to starboard. They would converge from three vectors, a classic pincer designed to confuse the destroyer's gun crews and maximize the probability of torpedo hits. The engine's hum deepened as Kelly eased PT-123 into full throttle. The boat surged forward, cutting through the water with the precision of a racing yacht. The bow rose slightly with each cresting wave, the deck slick with salt spray. Despite the danger, there was a controlled exhilaration among the crew, a shared understanding that this night could shift the balance of local naval power if executed correctly. At 21:45 hours, the destroyers altered course slightly, unknowingly steering directly into the Americans' path. Kelly's mind raced through calculations: torpedo range, speed of the target, bearing adjustments, tidal effects. Each decision was critical. A fraction of a second too early or too late could render the attack ineffective, or worse, leave the boats exposed to devastating gunfire. "Target on starboard bow," Kelly called. PT-122 adjusted course, engines growling in unison. PT-124 mirrored the maneuver on port. The Japanese destroyers remained oblivious, their decks dimly lit, and crews confident in their dominance. Kelly recalled post-war intelligence. The Japanese men considered the PT boats only capable of opportunistic harassment, expecting American vessels to flee at the first hint of retaliation. That assumption would prove fatal. Kelly gritted his teeth as he ordered the final approach. PT-123 moved into within 2,500 yards, the effective range of the Mark 8 torpedoes. Each crew member had rehearsed this moment countless times. The torpedoes had been primed, pressure settings verified, and launch angles double-checked. In the dim light, Kelly could see the crew's eyes, reflecting the tension and resolve shared among men who knew that mistakes tonight would be unforgiving. Then came the first flash of gunfire, not from the destroyers, but from a Japanese scout plane overhead, startled by the noise of three speeding boats. The PTS held steady, weaving slightly to minimize detection while maintaining the trajectory necessary for a clean torpedo launch. Seconds stretched like hours as the distance closed, engines roaring, waves slapping the hulls. Kelly gave the order. Torpedoes released. The torpedo tubes ejected their deadly cargo, each missile disappearing into the night, guided by nothing more than calculations, instinct, and luck. The PTs banked sharply to starboard and port, retreating toward the relative cover of darkness, aware that the destroyer's main guns would soon be trained on their position. The explosions came almost simultaneously, a series of violent detonations that threw water hundreds of feet into the air. Kelly peered through the spray. One destroyer, starboard, was listing. The Mark 8s had found their mark. The Japanese crew scrambled, desperately attempting to regain control, but the initial shock of an attack from an unseen threat had thrown their formations into temporary chaos. PT-123 and her companions did not linger. The retreat was as critical as the attack itself. At 40 knots, they skimmed through the waves, weaving to avoid the destroyer's return fire. 50 caliber rounds tore through the water around them, some striking the hull, some sparking harmlessly against mahogany. Kelly barked orders, adjusting course, keeping a tight formation to ensure mutual protection. In the immediate aftermath, the Japanese destroyers regained some semblance of order, but the element of surprise had already altered the engagement. According to later Allied intelligence, Japanese officers would later describe the attack as bewildering. 3 small vessels moving at impossible speed, striking without warning, and disappearing into the night before retaliation could be effective. The psychological impact, as much as the physical, would influence future engagements in the Solomons. Kelly allowed himself a brief exhale as the PT boats cleared the immediate engagement zone. PT-122 had sustained minor damage. A .50 caliber round had pierced a bulkhead, but no crew members were injured. PT-124 reported no hits. The success of the operation was due to meticulous preparation, precise execution, and the enemy's underestimation of the American craft. By 22:30 hours, the boats regrouped in a shallow cove behind a coral reef, engines idling, men scanning the horizon for further threats. Kelly reviewed the sequence of events with his officers, logging observations for post-action reports. This engagement, while brief, demonstrated that PT boats were more than mere nuisances. They were capable of striking fear into enemy forces when operated with skill, intelligence, and audacity. As dawn approached, Kelly looked out over the Solomons' turbulent waters. The Japanese destroyers had been surprised, damaged, and demoralized, but the war for control of these islands was far from over. Yet the events of this night would resonate across the theatre. Small, fast, and seemingly fragile vessels had altered the course of naval engagements, proving that underestimating the Americans came at a steep cost. The PT crews of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 returned to base, engines throttling down, hearts pounding, knowing that every patrol, every strike, and every calculated risk was part of a larger strategy to contain Japanese reinforcements and secure Guadalcanal. In the quiet moments before morning, Kelly allowed himself the satisfaction of knowing that the combination of speed, surprise, and precision had yielded tangible results. Proof that even the most formidable destroyers could be humbled by men willing to operate at the edge of danger. The early morning sun cast a pale orange glow over Tulagi harbour, yet the PT boats remained vigilant. The Japanese destroyers, stunned by the night's audacity, were regrouping, preparing for retaliatory patrols. Intelligence intercepted by Lieutenant Kelly's signals officer indicated that destroyer captains were furious, not merely at the damage inflicted, but at the psychological blow. For months they had operated with near impunity, confident that American forces in the Solomons were ineffective at night. Now the small, fast PT boats had challenged that assumption. Kelly convened a brief conference on PT 123's deck. "They'll be looking for us," he said, voice low but firm. "We've shown them we can strike. Expect counterattacks tonight, maybe sooner. Maintain strict radio silence, limit visible wakes, and remember, speed and surprise are our allies." His officers nodded, scanning charts and comparing intelligence reports with the boat's operational logs. Every detail mattered. Even minor miscalculations could be catastrophic against destroyers armed with 5-inch guns, torpedoes, and machine guns. By mid-morning, reconnaissance planes from Henderson Field had confirmed that Japanese destroyers were conducting extended sweeps, a visible attempt to flush out any PT boat positions. The crews understood the implication. They had moved from hunters to the hunted. Yet Kelly remained confident. The PT boat's small size, shallow draft, and high speed gave them the advantage in waters where destroyers were vulnerable to reefs and shoals. At 13:45, a radio intercept from the Japanese commander suggested a specific patrol pattern. Destroyers would circle Guadalcanal and Tulagi, attempting to draw PT boats into an open water confrontation. The Americans could not match the destroyers' firepower head-on. Any engagement would require cunning and precise timing. Kelly reviewed past reports of Tokyo Express runs, noting how Japanese confidence had repeatedly been their undoing. They underestimated small craft, believing that sheer speed and overwhelming armament guaranteed their security. As evening fell, Kelly gathered the crews for final checks. PT 122 and PT 124 were positioned 1,000 yards off PT 123's starboard and port, forming a compact triangle. Torpedoes were reloaded, fuel checked, and navigational lights covered. The sea was a dark mirror, rippling under the rising moon. Visibility was limited, perfect for PT boats to approach undetected, but also perfect for the Japanese to respond with deadly accuracy if the Americans made mistakes. At 19:20 hours, the first sign of the Japanese counterattack appeared. A destroyer's searchlight swept across the horizon, slicing the darkness with a sudden beam. Kelly had anticipated this. "Evasive formation," he barked. PT 123 banked sharply. the twin engines snarling as the bow lifted over a swell. The other boats mirrored the movement with practiced precision, weaving to reduce predictability and minimize the risk of torpedoes or gunfire finding a target. The destroyers, confident in their superior firepower, opened fire with machine guns and secondary cannons. Salvo after salvo lit the sky, water exploding around the PTS. Kelly's heart thumped as he calculated evasive maneuvers, knowing that even one hit could sink the boat or ignite its fuel tanks. He ordered a simultaneous increase in speed, 40 knots pushing the boats to their operational limits. The wake of each craft glowed faintly in the phosphorescence, revealing only brief, transient tracks. From his position, Kelly could see the destroyers' panic mounting. Their fire was fast but inaccurate, a reflection of the night's confusion. In post-war interrogations, Japanese officers admitted that their surprise at the previous night's attack had left them psychologically unprepared for such daring maneuvers. Confidence was replaced with caution, hesitation with calculation, and in combat, hesitation could be fatal. PT-124 launched the first torpedo of the counterstrike, angling to intercept a destroyer attempting to flank their position. The missile arced silently into the dark waters, invisible until it struck. Water erupted in a violent plume as the torpedo hit, throwing the crew into action drills, verifying the damage and maintaining formation. PT-122 followed suit, targeting another destroyer closing from the north. Kelly ordered PT-123 to maintain a shadowed position, ready to exploit openings. The engagement was chaotic, a blur of water, fire, and machine noise. Yet the PT crews remained disciplined, trusting in their training and the inherent advantages of their craft. Speed, maneuverability, and the ability to vanish into the night almost instantaneously. Japanese destroyers, powerful yet cumbersome, struggled to coordinate their fire amid sudden torpedo strikes and evasive maneuvers. By 2100 hours, the destroyers had suffered significant damage. Reports later confirmed that one vessel sustained a direct torpedo hit to the stern, another suffered engine damage from near-miss debris, and a third had minor hull breaches. Casualties were unknown at the time, but the effectiveness of the PT boats was undeniable. American crews had once again leveraged speed, surprise, and audacity to inflict disproportionate damage on a superior enemy. As the PT boats retreated to a secure cove, Kelly allowed himself a moment to assess the engagement. The night had proven that Japanese destroyers, for all their confidence and firepower, could not predict or counteract well-executed PT boat tactics. They underestimated the Americans, ignored intelligence reports, and assumed that the size and armament of the PTS rendered them harmless. The events of the evening would serve as a crucial lesson in both naval warfare and psychological strategy. By dawn, the waters around Tulagi were calm once more. The Japanese destroyers had returned to base for emergency repairs, their crews shaken but determined to reassert dominance. Kelly and his officers, meanwhile, prepared detailed action reports, analyzing the night's movements, enemy behavior, and torpedo performance. Every success, every mistake, and every observation would contribute to the evolving doctrine of PT boat operations in the Solomons, a doctrine that emphasized speed, surprise, and the ability to strike fear into an overconfident enemy. The battle had ended, but the war for control of the Solomons was far from over. For Kelly and the PT crews of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, the night had reaffirmed one crucial truth. Against complacent and overconfident foes, even the smallest craft could wield enormous power. The destroyers had learned the hard way that speed, stealth, and audacity could transform a handful of wooden boats into instruments of strategic impact, a lesson that would reverberate across the Pacific theatre in the months to come. The morning after the counterattack, Tulagi's harbour was quiet, yet tension lingered like a low fog. PT-123, PT-122, and PT-124 had returned intact, their crews weary but alert. Lieutenant Kelly reviewed the after-action reports while sipping bitter coffee, noting a recurring theme. Japanese destroyers, confident in their speed and armament, consistently underestimated small, agile opponents. Intelligence intercepted from radio traffic suggested that the enemy planned larger sweeps, assuming American craft would avoid confrontation rather than challenge them. Kelly's plan was simple: exploit this overconfidence. The PT boats could strike fast, retreat under cover of darkness, and force the destroyers to react rather than dictate the fight. Speed became both weapon and shield. With top speeds reaching 40 knots, the PTS could approach, launch torpedoes, and vanish before heavy guns could track them effectively. The challenge was maintaining coordination and avoiding the reefs that littered the Solomons waters. A single navigational error could be fatal. That night, the PTS moved into a narrow channel near Guadalcanal. Patrol reports indicated 2 Japanese destroyers had separated from the main group to investigate perceived threats. Kelly seized the opportunity. PT-124 slipped forward, her silhouette nearly invisible against the moonlit sea. PT-122 flanked to starboard, providing suppressive machine gun fire if necessary, while PT-123 held the rear, ready to exploit openings or cover a retreat. The destroyers, confident in their firepower, failed to detect the PT boats until the torpedoes were already in the water. Explosions rocked the channel as torpedoes struck one vessel amidships, disabling its engines. The second destroyer attempted to return fire, but its guns were slow to track the nimble PTS. In less than 15 minutes, the engagement ended. Both sides had taken hits, but the PTS had achieved their objective, demonstrating that tactical agility, coupled with precise intelligence, could neutralize numerical and firepower advantages. Post-action reports highlighted several lessons. First, Japanese overconfidence was a predictable weakness. Destroyers operated with the assumption that small boats could not pose a serious threat, a miscalculation that proved costly. Second, PT boat crews emphasized teamwork, coordination, and the disciplined use of speed, which allowed them to engage larger vessels effectively. Finally, intelligence and reconnaissance were critical. Knowing the destroyer's patrol routes, capabilities, and habits allowed Kelly to plan strikes with maximum impact and minimal risk. By dawn, PT crews were already planning the next operation. Each sortie reinforced their growing reputation. The Japanese had learned that underestimating these small, fast craft could no longer be an option. For Kelly and Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, the night's victories were both practical and psychological. The destroyers might have steel and guns, but the PTs had audacity, speed, and cunning, a combination that would continue to shape naval engagements across the Solomons. Night descended over the Solomons like a thick, suffocating blanket. The waters around Guadalcanal gleamed faintly under a waning moon, the surface broken only by the gentle wake of small craft or the occasional ripple from a passing reef. The air was heavy with salt and anticipation, carrying the scent of danger as the PT boats of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, led by Lieutenant John A. F. Jack Kelly, prepared for another perilous patrol. Unlike larger ships, these small, wooden-hulled torpedo boats moved silently and unpredictably, their speed their most formidable weapon. Kelly's mind raced as he reviewed the charts. The Japanese destroyers, arrogant in their assumed dominance, still relied on predictable routes and schedules to ferry men and materiel under the cover of night. PT-123, PT-124, and PT-122 slipped into the shadowed waters, engines barely audible above the natural hum of the ocean. Each crew knew their task: locate the enemy, strike swiftly, and vanish before retaliation could pin them down. Kelly remembered the skepticism of his superiors back in Espiritu Santo, who doubted the effectiveness of PT boats against destroyers. But experience in the Solomons had taught him otherwise. Speed, surprise, and audacity could level the playing field. As they patrolled, Japanese destroyers steamed along the channel, cutting a path that seemed to ignore the risks of shallow reefs and coral outcroppings. One by one, the PTS picked up the faint, irregular silhouettes against the horizon. The Japanese captains, confident in the presumed invincibility of their ships, were unaware that a small, determined strike force was closing in on them at nearly 40 knots. Kelly signalled the advance. PT-124 surged forward first, torpedoes primed, engines vibrating with raw power. PT-122 moved parallel, ready to deliver machine gun covering fire, while PT-123 followed closely, prepared to exploit any opportunity that might arise. At precisely 2300 hours, the squadron detected 2 destroyers moving at full speed through the channel. The larger ships cut through the water with effortless dominance, their sleek hulls gleaming in the moonlight, and their deck-mounted guns glinting in the dim illumination. To a casual observer, the destroyers were untouchable, and many in command had long dismissed PT boats as nuisances rather than credible threats. But Kelly knew that the Japanese overconfidence was his advantage. From a distance of just over 2,000 yards, the torpedoes were launched. The crew braced for the inevitable counterfire, though Kelly had planned meticulously to minimize exposure. The first torpedo struck a destroyer amidships with a muted explosion that rocked the ship violently, sending a plume of water skyward. Sailors on deck were thrown to the deck, scrambling for any semblance of defensive action. The second torpedo found its mark in the engine room of the other destroyer, crippling its ability to maneuver. The PTS, meanwhile, were already weaving away, using their agility to evade return fire that splashed ineffectually into the dark waters. Machine gun bursts from the PTs tore across the decks of the damaged destroyers, but Kelly's orders were strict: hit hard, hit fast, and retreat before the Japanese could effectively respond. Within minutes, the squadron had executed a textbook hit-and-run attack, leaving the enemy ships listing and damaged in the channel while the PT boats melted into the darkness. Radio chatter from the Japanese revealed confusion and panic. Destroyer captains demanded immediate reports from their subordinates, but the night had shattered their confidence. The patrol did not end there. Kelly kept the boats in the area, circling silently to observe the aftermath and ensure no reinforcements approached undetected. Intelligence reports, often overlooked in the past, now proved invaluable. Kelly's notes would later become part of the U.S. Navy's after-action reports, demonstrating the effectiveness of small craft in disrupting enemy operations. Each PT boat maneuver had been choreographed, practiced and rehearsed under the harshest conditions, and that discipline had paid off. When the squadron finally regrouped in a sheltered cove, the crews were exhilarated but exhausted. Faces were streaked with sweat and salt, eyes wide with adrenaline, but a sense of achievement filled the small boats. PT boats had proven that size and firepower were not the sole determinants of naval effectiveness. The combination of intelligence, surprise, and daring had allowed a handful of small wooden boats to strike fear into the heart of the Japanese Navy. Kelly addressed his crews, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "Tonight, we showed what PTS can do. The Japanese thought we were a nuisance. They were wrong. Remember this: speed, accuracy, and boldness can win battles no one expects." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. For these young men, the success of the night was validation not only of their courage, but of the PT boat as a revolutionary tool of warfare. The Japanese, for their part, were shaken. The damage inflicted was relatively small in tonnage, but the psychological impact was profound. Destroyer captains who had once scoffed at the threat of PT boats now studied reports and questioned routines that had been followed for months without incident. The U.S. Navy's emphasis on training, night maneuvers, and high-speed torpedo tactics was beginning to pay off in real, measurable ways. By the time dawn approached, the PTS had returned to base. Engines were shut down, torpedoes accounted for, and damage inspections completed. Kelly filed his report with the squadron command, noting every detail: positions, maneuvers, torpedo hits, and observed Japanese reactions. The success of this night would ripple through future operations, influencing both US tactics and Japanese countermeasures. In the Solomons, the war was far from over. The Tokyo Express continued, reinforcements and supplies still flowing under the cover of night. But the PT boats had proven that audacity could offset firepower, that even the smallest craft could challenge the might of the Japanese destroyers, and that in the darkness, ingenuity often mattered more than armour. The night of reckoning had come, and for Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 it was only the beginning. The morning sun rose over the Solomons with a deceptive calm. Guadalcanal's rugged coastlines glimmered in pale light, but behind the seeming tranquility, the Japanese Navy was in disarray. Reports of the previous night's attacks by Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had reached the destroyer command, shaking the confidence that had once defined the Tokyo Express operations. Destroyer captains, previously unchallenged in the treacherous waters of the Solomons, now faced the uncomfortable truth. Small, fast, lightly armoured American PT boats could deliver precise, crippling strikes against ships they had assumed invulnerable. Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commander of the Tokyo Express, convened a meeting with his senior destroyer captains aboard a command vessel anchored just outside of the channel. The room was thick with tension. Officers pored over charts that displayed nightly PT boat patrol routes and past engagements, all while discussing possible countermeasures. Tanaka, known for his composure under fire, now exhibited subtle signs of unease. The reports were clear. US torpedo boats had hit multiple destroyers in a single night, striking with speed and vanishing before counterattack could be coordinated. "Never before have we encountered such audacity from these small craft," Tanaka said, his voice measured but firm. "We have underestimated them, and that will no longer be allowed." Effective immediately, all destroyers will implement zig-zag maneuvers and unpredictable route variations during reinforcement runs. Night reconnaissance will be doubled. No boat will proceed without escorting patrols. The captains nodded, though privately some were skeptical. Japanese naval doctrine prized speed and offensive initiative, and the idea that small PT boats could dictate terms of engagement was difficult to accept. Yet the damage inflicted, though limited in tonnage, had created a psychological impact far greater than the actual material loss. Morale among destroyer crews, once buoyed by a sense of invincibility, now carried an undercurrent of fear and caution. On the docks, PT boat crews had barely returned to base before intelligence officers relayed the latest observations. Radar sweeps indicated Japanese ships were altering their usual schedules, moving more cautiously, and coordinating escorts in ways that previous doctrine had deemed unnecessary. Lieutenant John A. F. Jack Kelly studied these developments with keen interest. The enemy's reactions confirmed what he had long suspected. PT boats, while lightly armed and vulnerable, could influence the operational decisions of a far more powerful adversary simply by exploiting speed, stealth, and surprise. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyer crews were being drilled relentlessly. Officers emphasized alertness during night operations, practicing rapid response drills against potential torpedo attacks. Spotlights were adjusted, lookouts stationed at multiple points, and gunnery teams trained for split-second reactions. The destroyers, once confident in their ability to dominate smaller craft, now moved like hunters, aware that the prey was as cunning as it was dangerous. Yet even as Japanese forces adapted, the PT boats refined their tactics in response to new challenges. Kelly and his squadron spent daylight hours conducting simulations, reviewing last night's engagement and identifying weaknesses in Japanese responses. They learned to anticipate zig-zag maneuvers, employing synchronized attacks from multiple directions to exploit the gaps in destroyer formations. Every exercise reinforced a simple principle. Audacity and coordination could compensate for lack of armour and firepower. By mid-October, the confrontation between PT boats and Japanese destroyers had evolved into a deadly chess game. Intelligence reports revealed the Japanese were beginning to stagger their Tokyo Express runs, sending smaller detachments instead of full squadrons to reduce potential losses. They experimented with smoke screens and rapid acceleration at choke points, all designed to mitigate the threat posed by the fast-moving torpedo craft. The Japanese were no longer just transporting troops and supplies. They were engaging in active countermeasures against a perceived new class of enemy. From the US perspective, these adaptations validated the effectiveness of PT operations. Each Japanese precaution, each change in procedure, indicated that even the perception of threat could yield strategic advantage. Kelly understood that the psychological component of warfare was as vital as the physical. The destroyers' constant vigilance slowed reinforcement runs, disrupted supply lines, and forced the Japanese into operational patterns that were less efficient and more predictable in other ways. One night, a detachment of PT boats intercepted a convoy attempting to navigate the channel under the new Japanese procedures. The destroyers were cautious, executing sharp turns and deploying smoke screens as predicted. Yet Kelly's squadron, relying on meticulous observation and radio coordination, adjusted their attack vectors in real time. Torpedoes were launched with precision, finding their targets despite evasive maneuvers. The destroyers suffered additional hits, further reinforcing the notion that PT boat attacks could not be ignored. The success of these missions had a ripple effect across US Naval Command in the Solomons. Reports emphasized that PT boats were no longer a mere nuisance, but a credible force capable of altering enemy behavior. The men of MTBR-3 became increasingly confident, their training validated in repeated nighttime victories. And while each engagement carried immense risk, any miscalculation could result in a PT boat being obliterated by a destroyer's guns. The audacity of the crews inspired a new sense of tactical innovation. In retrospect, the Japanese adaptation was a necessary but insufficient response. While zigzags, smoke screens, and staggered convoy formations reduced immediate vulnerability, they could not eliminate the fundamental advantage of speed, surprise, and unpredictability wielded by the PT boats. Every successful strike forced the Japanese to reassess, adjust, and expend resources that might otherwise have gone toward the reinforcement of Guadalcanal itself. By late October, the psychological war was in full swing. Japanese destroyer captains approached every night with a measure of caution that contrasted sharply with their prior confidence. Small wooden PT boats had managed to impose a new reality on one of the most feared naval forces in the Pacific. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. Ingenuity, discipline, and audacity could turn even the smallest craft into a strategic lever capable of challenging larger, more heavily armed adversaries. As Kelly prepared his patrols for another night, he reflected on the evolving dance of offense and defense. The destroyers had adapted, yes, but adaptation came with its own costs: slower movement, increased vigilance, and the constant strain of anticipation. The PT boats, for all their vulnerability, had achieved what many deemed impossible. They had made the Japanese fight differently, even reconsider the way they had long dominated the night waters of the Solomons. The war in the Solomons continued, fierce and unrelenting. And while the Tokyo Express would attempt further runs, each one was now shadowed by the knowledge that a handful of fast, nimble American boats could strike with devastating effect, shattering the confidence of even the most seasoned destroyer captain. The chessboard of the Pacific had changed, and in that quiet, strategic shift, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had carved its mark on the campaign, proving that in warfare, perception could be as lethal as firepower. The night of October 27, 1942, descended over the Solomons like a velvet curtain. Guadalcanal's coastline vanished into darkness, and the only light came from distant stars reflected on restless waters. For Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, this night would become the defining moment of their Solomons campaign, a test not just of speed and firepower, but of nerve, coordination, and daring. Lieutenant John A. F. Jack Kelly stood on the deck of PT-109, peering into the inky blackness. His crew moved with quiet efficiency, loading torpedoes, checking radio communications, and ensuring the engines were tuned to maximum performance. The intelligence briefing had been clear. A convoy of 3 Japanese destroyers carrying troops and supplies to Guadalcanal was moving north under a strict zig-zag pattern and equipped with reinforced lookouts. This was no ordinary patrol. It was the culmination of weeks of Japanese adaptations to PT boat attacks. Kelly's pulse quickened, not from fear, but anticipation. He knew that the destroyers expected caution, expected hesitation, expected the standard night patrol. They did not expect speed. Full throttle, 21 knots had always been the standard maximum for PT boats in operational engagements. But tonight, Kelly intended to push the boats to their mechanical limits, 40 knots, a velocity that had never been attempted in an actual combat scenario. It was a risk that could tear the engines apart, or worse, send a torpedo boat crashing into the reef. Yet the opportunity to strike a decisive blow against the Tokyo Express made the gamble necessary. The squadron slipped silently into the channel. The water boiled behind the PT boats as they accelerated beyond normal operating speeds, the engines screaming in protest. Kelly maintained a tight formation with PT-111 and PT-114, radio silence enforced except for hand signals and prearranged maneuvers. Every motion had been drilled countless times. The crew knew that at 40 knots any error could be fatal. Across the channel, Japanese destroyers advanced with confidence tinged with caution. The captains had noted the PT boats' growing audacity in previous nights, but they assumed the vessels would continue to operate at conventional speeds. Lookouts strained into darkness, and gunners prepared for the faintest trace of torpedo wakes, but the destroyers had no idea that the Americans were coming faster than ever before, closing the distance with terrifying rapidity. Kelly's voice was steady over the internal intercom. "Engage on my mark. Remember, surprise is everything. No hesitation. Keep steady. Engines full." The crew's hands were tight on throttles and torpedo triggers, eyes scanning the shadowy silhouettes ahead. In the span of a few tense minutes, the PT boats closed from over 2,000 yards to under 500. The first destroyer, oblivious to the approaching threat, maintained its steady course. Kelly made his move, a sharp turn, bringing PT-109 alongside the enemy's flank, engines howling as the hull cut through waves. Torpedo tubes were aligned, and the crew held their collective breath. Then, in rapid succession, torpedoes were launched. The water erupted as the warheads streaked through the black channel. Explosions rocked the destroyer's stern first, then the midship section, sending shrapnel and fire into the night. PT-111 and PT-114 mirrored the maneuver, hitting the other 2 destroyers almost simultaneously. For a brief moment, time seemed suspended. The destroyers, confident in their supremacy, were now fighting for survival against boats that moved faster than their eyes could track. Chaos ensued. Japanese gunners scrambled, firing wildly into the dark, but at 40 knots the PT boats were nearly untouchable. Machine guns barked in reply from the small craft, suppressing fire to mask movements. Kelly's crew ducked as a shell slammed into the water mere yards away, sending geysers skyward. Yet the PT boats pressed forward, relentless in their strike. By the time the smoke and fire cleared, the results were undeniable. One destroyer sank almost immediately, a second limping badly with a crippled engine and fire consuming its aft deck, and the third forced to retreat under heavy fire. Japanese captains radioed frantic reports, acknowledging the unprecedented audacity of the American attack. Small craft, unbelievable speed, torpedoes from nowhere. One message crackled before the line went dead. Kelly exhaled, his body still tense from adrenaline. Around him, his crew shared a silent acknowledgement of victory. The 40-knot run had succeeded, not just in damaging the enemy, but in validating the potential of PT boats to alter the strategic calculus of naval warfare in the Solomons. No longer were they mere nuisances. They were instruments capable of shaping the behavior of larger, ostensibly superior vessels. The aftermath rippled through both sides. Japanese destroyers, even those that survived, approached all future operations with heightened caution, deploying more escorts, adjusting speed, and reinforcing anti-small boat procedures. They now respected the lethal capability of the PT boats, understanding that failure to anticipate audacious tactics could result in catastrophic losses. For the Americans, the engagement became a benchmark in PT operations doctrine. Squadron training manuals were updated to include high-speed interception tactics, coordinated multi-boat strikes, and the psychological dimension of unexpected aggression. Kelly and his men received commendations, but more importantly, they had earned the knowledge that strategy, speed, and daring could compensate for disparities in size and firepower. By sunrise, the channel was quiet again, save for the drifting smoke and the distant cries of survivors clinging to wreckage. The Solomons, battered yet unbowed, had witnessed a tactical evolution. The PT boats, small, fast, and lightly armed, had forced the mighty Japanese destroyers to reconsider every assumption. They had proven that in the shadowed waters of Guadalcanal, audacity could tip the scales of war.